Today at the National Press Club, distinguished Professor Marcia Langton, an internationally recognised anthropologist and academic. Professor Langton was a co-author of the Indigenous Voice co-design process, a document outlining how the proposed constitutionally enshrined body could operate. Marcia Langton with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address. My name's David Crowe. I'm the Chief Political Correspondent at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age and a Director here at the Club. Our guest today is Marcia Langton, Distinguished Professor and Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. Professor Langton is a key figure in the Yes campaign for constitutional recognition and an Indigenous voice. In 2019, the Coalition Government named her, along with Tom Calma, to lead the expert panel to design the voice. And their work led to a final report in 2019 on the voice. That report continues to influence the debate all the way to the October 14 referendum. Professor Langton was born and raised in regional Queensland and went to 9 schools, including her high school in Brisbane. She once said she grew up the old-fashioned, hard way, in places with awful racism. She left Australia, travelled widely, and returned to study at the Australian National University here in Canberra. She was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2020 to recognise her work in education and in Aboriginal rights. Her most recent book with Erin Corn is First Knowledge Law, The Way of the Ancestors, about Indigenous law. Another book is Welcome to Country, a guide to Indigenous Australia, which is useful for anyone who's planning to travel around the country. Ahead of the referendum, we'll be hearing from various sides in the debate. Next Thursday, we'll be hearing from Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, a leading voice in the No campaign. And before we proceed, I want to acknowledge some of the people that we have here in the room, including Professor Tom Calma. Thank you for joining us. Elizabeth Lee, the leader of the Liberal Party in the ACT. And Margot Neal, who's the editor of the series of books, of which First Knowledge Law is the latest edition. For those of you watching at home, you can join the conversation on Twitter, where our handle is @PressClubAust, and you can use the hashtag NPC. So let's get straight to it. There's a lot to discuss and a lot to hear about. Please welcome Marcia Langton to the podium.
Thank you for introducing me, David. That was a very accurate summary of
I'm glad about that.
my life. I acknowledge the traditional owners, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I acknowledge their elders past and present, and I acknowledge their ancestors and other ancestors here in this place. The ancestors of present-day Indigenous Australians arrived in Northern Australia at least 65,000 years ago, according to archaeologist Chris Clarkson and his team, who investigated Mudged Bibi in Arnhem Land in Northern Australia. I recently co-authored the book that David mentioned with my colleague in the Indigenous Knowledge Institute at the University of Melbourne, Professor Erin Corn, and as you now know, it's entitled Law, The Way of the Ancestors, published by Thames and Hudson in the First Knowledges series. Some legal scholars have responded to our book, saying that it's the first of its kind for its detailed account of a values system and philosophical traditions that have long informed Indigenous laws in Australia. In the book, Aaron and I explain legal systems and leadership structures that have governed life in Australia for many millennia and carry countless generations of human knowledge that have enabled societies to thrive here for millennia. Our law is beautiful. It recognises the sanctity of all human beings as well as the sanctity of all things in creation. And it constantly challenges people to strive towards these ideals. even though as individuals we are imperfect. Our law challenges us to strive towards these ideals precisely because we are imperfect, so that we conduct ourselves with respect and take responsibility for our obligations, even in the most challenging of times. These were the laws of this land for 65,000 years. In less than 230 years, the first Australians have been reduced to the most disadvantaged Australians, colonised by the British in 1788. Our peoples were almost wiped from the face of the earth by a brutal rolling frontier over more than a century of sustained warfare that ended only in the 20th century, and also by diseases introduced by the British: smallpox, measles and influenza, to name three. As a descendant of the Iman people who were massacred in the hundreds over decades of conflict, raised in Queensland under racist laws, and now in my 70s, it is clear to me that the winds of change blowing across our continent now are our last hope of surviving as the first peoples with any of our laws, cultures and languages intact. We were totally excluded from the Constitution that came into effect in 1901 by specific clauses that cast our diverse peoples as a race. With more than 200 languages, more often described as 600 language varieties, our own laws, traditions, customs, we are peoples, not a race. Although amended in 1967, following a referendum to remove 2 discriminatory references from the Constitution, it still retains 2 discriminatory clauses: the race power at section 51(26) and section 25. The alterations in 1967 removed clauses discriminating against First Australians, that allowing the Australian Parliament to make laws in relation to First Australians and include First Australians in the national census. Now the Australian Parliament has the power to make laws that may cause us harm, a matter of common law decided in the Cartignery case that held that the changes to the race power made by the 1967 referendum did not confine its use to the making of beneficial laws. This was an unintended consequence, I believe, of those alterations. As a matter of black letter law, the High Court confirmed that the race power could be used in a way that causes us harm. This is why talking about the voice also means talking about the future, because that's at the very heart of this proposition and this referendum: a better and more equal future so that all Australians can choose the Australia that we want, and a better future that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can build for themselves with a say in decisions that affect our lives. Far too often, decisions that affect us are not based on the wishes of Indigenous people and not informed by expert advice. The result is an enormous loss of trust and confidence in governments among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It is this lack of trust and confidence that is a major contributing factor to the lack of progress in closing the gap. The Voice, should it eventuate, will be able to rebuild trust and confidence and engage Indigenous Australians in an empowering way to have a say in their own futures. Strengthening the sense of agency among our peoples is vital to improving outcomes and enabling people to take up the opportunities that other Australians enjoy. At least 4 federal Indigenous consultative bodies have been established and then dismantled on political whims. With each election, the advances we make are swept away and new and far too often inappropriate policies replacing them, policies in which we have had little or no say. The Uluru Statement from the Heart was directed to the Australian people, not to politicians, not to Parliament, but to the Australian people. It was based on consultations with thousands of Indigenous people. Reputable surveys show that more than 80% of Indigenous Australians support this form of recognition. The referendum question links 2 propositions: recognition of Indigenous Australians through entrenching in the Constitution or enshrining in the Constitution a mechanism, a voice to make representations on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to the Parliament and to the Executive Government. Its composition, functions, powers and procedures will be legislated by the Parliament. This proposition is the barest measure imaginable that would give Indigenous Australians a formal say in policies and legislation that affect us. For too long, conversations have been held about us and not with us. We are asking merely for an advisory body to ameliorate the power of the Parliament to make laws that could cause us harm. But the proposition does not require that the Parliament or Executive Government accept that advice. It is our hope that evidence-based policies informed by the people affected will prevail should the voice be established. The disadvantages faced by a majority of Indigenous Australians are extreme by any measure. They require sophisticated policy responses, always difficult to achieve. We do not need sophistry. Australians have not voted in a referendum for 24 years, almost a quarter of a century. In 1999, the majority of Australian voters voted against the question of our nation becoming a republic. The Republican movement lost that referendum because the then Prime Minister, John Howard, confused the yes voters into believing that there was a better model they should vote for. We are now boomers, and it is highly unlikely we will ever see Australia become a republic. Young Australians will have no memory of that tortured, tricky debate a quarter of a century ago. The arguments of Dutton, Price, Mundine and others in the No campaign are specious and increasingly absurd, appealing to their base with claims that the proposal will racially divide the nation and create two classes of Australians based on race. This is utter nonsense. These lies, however, are effective with a growing minority. Few Australians have knowledge of their national constitution, and even less about Indigenous people. Pamphlets distributed by the government to every household setting out the yes and no cases have been received by most households now. When various media outlets and fact-check services have examined this material, the finding is invariably that the yes case is entirely accurate and the no case is substantially false. Australian voters have been deceived by the no case and by the relentless negativity and conned into believing that the referendum proposal will not lead to better outcomes. Where are the solutions from the no case? They are using the referendum proposal and an invitation from Indigenous Australians as an attack on the government. Those in the no campaign have no policy answers to address the life outcomes of Indigenous Australians. They want you to accept more of the same old failure. I could give you many examples of policy failure. Here's one. ATSIC was abolished in 2004 and was replaced by shared responsibility agreements. The first one proposed that a petrol bowser costing $172,000 be installed in Mulan, a tiny remote community in the Western Desert, and in return the people would be coerced by the Western Australian government into washing the children's faces every day and showering every day. Did they improve the water supply? No. The response of the health sector was damning, and experts were concerned about the breach of human rights and health service delivery norms involved in this exercise. Of course, it achieved nothing. No progress in health outcomes, and further demoralised the community. We should also not forget that morning in 2007, when we woke to find that the government had sent the Australian Defence Force into Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory under the guise of protecting Aboriginal children from sexual abuse. Ignoring the actual findings of the Little Children Are Sacred report, which found that neglect and overcrowding were the main issues, all Aboriginal men were cast as pedophiles, and the government introduced 500 pages of legislation, suspended the Racial Discrimination Act, enforced anti-pornography signs at the gates of 76 Aboriginal communities, placed all Aboriginal security recipients under a 50% income quarantine, and assumed control of the land in these communities, placing them under enforced 50-year leases. There was much more that was discriminatory. The trust and confidence of the Aboriginal people of the Northern Territory was shattered. Political opportunism, rather than working with Aboriginal communities, ruined the lives of tens of thousands of people. In response, the Aboriginal community responded with another strategy, and I'd like to acknowledge Professor Tom Calma's role in this. The Closing the Gap strategy, agreed upon by the Australian governments in 2007 and renewed with more robust targets in 2017, has seen little progress. There has been reportable progress on only 2 educational targets, and parity is a distant prospect on present trends. There is nearly 10 years difference in life expectancy as between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and that's only an average. In many areas, it's far greater. While we make up about 3% of the entire Australian population, our people account for 32% of the entire prison population. Our unemployment rates are about 3 times the rate of non-Indigenous people, and infant mortality remains far too high in one of the richest nations on earth. That gap is not closing fast enough. Lives are at stake. A majority yes vote is important for our children and future generations. The statistics on infant mortality rates explain the concerns of tens of thousands of Indigenous women like me. Since the 2008 target baseline, the Indigenous child mortality rate has improved slightly by around 7%. However, the mortality rate for non-Indigenous children has improved at a faster rate, and as a result, the gap has widened. Why wouldn't you vote yes to give us a say in reaching parity in life expectancy for our children and future generations? We envisage a nation in which our legitimate leaders are able to give formal advice to the Parliament and executive government to improve our lives. Would the Voice close the gap on the alarming array of disadvantages immediately? No. But the National Advisory Committee and the regional committees would be able to recommend effective measures to more quickly close these gaps. This is because of the enormous issue of trust. A guaranteed Indigenous voice will be able to rebuild the trust necessary to engage a substantial majority in pathways to better life outcomes. With Professor Tom Calma, I chaired the Senior Advisory Group from 2019 to 2021 of the Voice Co-Design project. It's our report, not a government report. We consulted with more than 10,000 Australians in more than 160 communities and towns. Our proposal in the Indigenous Voice Co-Design report seeks to close the gap between politicians and government departments that make policy in local communities, whose experiences these policymakers largely do not share. The bureaucracy exists to measure, categorise and report. It is largely administered by well-paid public servants who are responsible to their ministers and the government policies of the day. The referendum proposal is not about giving some people a greater say than others based on their race. There is no presumption of a singular Indigenous point of view, and we are certainly not arguing that the discredited pseudoscience of racial difference should play any role in our liberal democracy. Instead, by acknowledging our diverse histories, cultures, stories, experiences and challenges, we can begin to work more effectively together to ensure that first Australians Thrive, not survive. Thrive, not survive. Our process and the Referendum Council that sponsored the Uluru Statement from the Heart were both recommended by the 2018 Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The co-chairs were Senator Patrick Dodson and Mr Julian Leeser. Until earlier this year, Mr Julian Leeser was the opposition spokesman on Aboriginal affairs. He resigned when his own work was misrepresented by Peter Dutton. He's now on the backbench and he supports the voice. He supports the referendum question. He and Patrick Dodson recommended that Indigenous voice arrangements should primarily focus on local and regional bodies. The proposals that our report, in what's referred to as the Marcia Langton report, are based on an understanding that such local and regional groups are looking for genuine, constructive and long-term partnerships that not only address current priorities and needs, but also rise up to meet opportunities and aspirations for the future. We heard a similar story across the country. We drew on the strengths of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their communities to build on and learn from both previous and current initiatives. Let me give you an example of a complex long-term challenge: housing. When ATSIC was shut down in 2004, that body was in the middle of completing an audit on overcrowding in Indigenous housing across the country. It became evident that overcrowding was a significant factor contributing to disadvantages in health, education and employment. More recently, a report was published based on a survey in Madu country in the Western Desert, which found that at least half the houses in many communities are fit only for demolition. Since 2015, the situation has worsened significantly. Aboriginal leaders and the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Linda Burney, consistently raise housing as a key issue for the voice to address. It's a complex policy issue that involves the Federation of the Commonwealth and all states and territories. A long-term plan is needed to provide adequate housing for a population of less than 1 million to overcome the severe disadvantages faced by Indigenous communities. A key aspect of our report was the framework for local and regional voices. We suggested a flexible, principles-based approach to accommodate the diversity of communities and build on existing arrangements already in place across the country. We recommended this framework would be one of the two parts of the Indigenous voice, along with the national voice. Each local and regional voice would comprise a broad range of Indigenous people, family groups, community organisations and other stakeholders. There would be governance arrangements in each region. As part of this, there would be clear pathways and mechanisms for local communities and groups to participate in its work and enable local issues to be dealt with at the local level. These arrangements would be designed and led by communities according to local context, history and culture in a way that is consistent with the principles of self-determination and other principles we set out, 9 in total. Different regions have different priorities. For instance, the Land Councils of the Northern Territory met and the Policy Officer at the Central Land Council, Dr Josie Douglas, an Aranda woman, explained that there would be 3 priorities for their region. Their first priority was food security, and housing was another one. Meanwhile, in the East Kimberley, the priority of the people there is early childhood measures to improve the lives of young children as they face rising youth incarceration rates and suicide. Keeping their young people out of juvenile detention centres is their highest priority. So priorities will vary across regions. Radically lowering incarceration rates of both adults and children, the rates of removal of Aboriginal children from their families into out-of-home care, and also suicide rates are high priorities everywhere. Importantly, we recommended that local and regional voices would not displace or undermine bodies with existing statutory roles or specific functions, but provide links for involvement. This was particularly important for the Coalition of Peaks, which was developing at that time the National Partnership Agreement with all Australian governments to close the gap. We insisted that the local and regional voice arrangements must align with guiding principles, such as that one. We did receive submissions from people with disabilities. 1 in 4 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live with a disability. We recommended the establishment of a permanent advisory body comprised of Indigenous people with disabilities, and since more than 60% of our population is under the age of 25, we recommended another permanent advisory body made up of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individuals. Those under the age of 18 who are not permitted by law to serve on government advisory bodies could still join this advisory group. We recommended the principle of cultural leadership to connect those responsible for cultural laws and customs in each place, ensuring legitimacy and relevance in the Indigenous world. The starting point would differ for each region. Some regions, such as the Western Deserts, which lack similar governance arrangements, might need more time to establish new or build on existing arrangements. We expected each region to have a leadership group accommodating local community-based groups, a backbone team, and of course gender equity, which we strongly emphasised. We recommended a whole-of-government approach, envisioning legislation at the Commonwealth, state and territory levels, along with cross-jurisdictional arrangements that set out government's commitments and enable local and regional voices to collaborate across government levels. With regard to the national voice, we recommended that, in accordance with each state and territory's demographics, there be 1 or 2 representatives. For instance, Tasmania and the Australian Capital Territory would have 1 representative each, while larger states would have 2. We also recommended an additional seats for up to 5 remote areas with the most severe disadvantages in Australia. Further, we suggested extra seats for Torres Strait Islanders living on the mainland. There are other recommendations in relation to the national voice. A power of work has been done, and there is a lot of valuable information ready to be put to good use. But the key point is this: none of what I've just talked about should go in the Constitution. The Constitution is a place for principles. It sets the foundation for Parliament and the people to build on. That's why, if Australians vote yes, the implementation of all this detail and design work will be in the hands of the Australian Parliament, the representatives of the people. Not just in creating the advisory body, but in maintaining it. Part 3 of the proposed constitutional alteration makes this crystal clear. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. So whether individual members and senators vote yes or no at the referendum, they will have ample and equal opportunity to shape the design of the voice. Again, this is as it should be. What I've summarised for you is only a portion of the product of over a decade of formal processes. For myself and many others, it represents the culmination of many more years of work. Let me assure you, all of us who have strived and struggled to get to this point keenly understand that this is our one chance. And Australians should know that too. I urge Australians who are as yet to make up their minds, don't imagine that there's another opportunity around the corner. Don't think your no vote goes in a different pile marked next time. In this referendum, there are only 2 options: a yes vote that delivers recognition through a voice and all the hope and healing it represents. By adopting the Uluru Statement's invitation for us to all walk together in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Or a no vote, which binds us more closely, all of us, to a broken status quo. Another turn of the cycle of poverty and disadvantage and disempowerment. We advised that the Voice should not have funding responsibilities or program responsibilities. And so many of the claims made about that are simply false. This is not about giving some people a greater say than others based on their race. There is no presumption of an Indigenous point of view. Instead, by acknowledging our diverse histories, our cultures, stories, experiences and challenges, we can begin to work more effectively to ensure that Indigenous Australians thrive, not just survive. Our Indigenous health sector was extraordinarily successful during the COVID-19 pandemic, resulting in a dramatic reversal of the gap. All colonised Indigenous populations internationally are at very high risk from pandemics like COVID-19. They are more likely to have chronic disease, live in overcrowded housing, and have limited understanding of virus infections, and those who live in cities with potential exposures being high are much more at risk. This is the case in Australia also. Thus, we expected very high infections, hospitalisations and death rates in Aboriginal populations from COVID. In fact, Aboriginal populations had 6 times fewer cases than non-Indigenous groups across the whole nation, a complete reversal of the gap. In 2020 and 2021, there were low rates of hospitalisation, no deaths, no cases in remote communities, and no cases after the Black Lives Matter marches. This extraordinary and unexpected outcome was due to the Aboriginal leadership taking control of all activities for prevention, diagnosis and treatment, as well as housing, social and medical support. The National Aboriginal Community Health Organisation and State and Territory Regional Remote Area Services, the Aboriginal Community Control Services, demanded and received all the resources they needed to implement this success. They had a voice which was acted upon. So there is an example of what the Voice could achieve. We hope that this proposal for constitutional recognition by establishing the Voice will bring reconciliation to the nation, reduce divisions and, most importantly, empower First Peoples to have a formal say in government decisions. This is not intended to make Australians feel guilty about the often painful past of Australia's settlement and treatment of Indigenous people. To the contrary, the intention is to unite Australians in what Noel Pearson has referred to as completing the Commonwealth by including and recognising Indigenous people in its rule book. Our objective is to overcome division, to build a future reconciled with our past, to shape our country into a cohesive whole by including Indigenous Australians, excluded for almost 70 years in our constitutional fabric. Why wouldn't you acknowledge us in the Constitution? Facts, not fictions, are crucial in the public square. Our proposal takes nothing away from others. It does not give us any more power than the hundreds of other advisory committees. Given that we are starting with severe handicaps, the acknowledgement of and the Voice will give us a say to empower our people to become more engaged, just as we did during the pandemic to reverse the gaps. Vote yes so that we thrive, not just survive, as peoples, the First Peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Langton, for that speech. We'll go to questions from the journalists here in a moment, but I'll get to ask the first question. And my question does overlap with your speech. You've talked at length in the speech about the case for the Voice, but I thought I would pose a question that really looks at people who are reluctant about this change. They're sceptical. They might be called the soft nose. Maybe they're resistant to change in general. Maybe they're particularly concerned about changing the Constitution. They might say, well, look, why can't we have consultation in other formats? Why does it have to be this particular change to the Constitution? So what's your message to them? Why does it have to be this way?
Well, there's a habit in government circles of consulting with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, and their methods and approaches have become tick box, if you like. And what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people really want rarely makes its way through the bureaucratic haze. Bureaucrats say, oh, we consulted with them, but often we find that what we said is not reflected in the outcome. A very good example is family and domestic violence. Many of us who work in this field have been calling for years for a standalone national action plan for family and domestic violence in Indigenous communities, because it takes on very different forms and must be dealt with in different ways from the typical intimate partner violence in cities and towns and suburbs, where, yes, Indigenous Australians are sometimes involved, but much of the violence in our communities takes different forms, and it takes place in very different settings, social and kinship settings, and of course the context of police engagement with families where violence is occurring often results in the women being the victims being arrested rather than the perpetrators, and child protection services being automatically called by the police and the children removed into out-of-home care, leaving Indigenous women terrified of calling for help for fear that they themselves as victims might be arrested, or even that their partners might be arrested, and particularly that their children will be removed. And so this is why we need to listen to our frontline workers and adopt the measures that they put in place. However, for the many years that we've been raising these issues, we were not listened to, and it was not reflected in the National Action Plan at all, and there have been several of them. We've finally, under this government, had a constructive engagement with the Minister, and we've had some input into the National Action Plan, which is now a standalone Indigenous Action Plan, and we hope for better outcomes. And so we cannot reduce the extraordinary rates of violence in our communities unless our people, both perpetrators and victims, are directly engaged in the measures. So that has been on my radar for many years. In fact, the last time I spoke here was with Jacinta Price, now Senator Jacinta Price, on this very matter many years ago. And that's just one of the issues. Another is the suicide of children. Governments have not been listening. Police have not been listening. There have been coronial inquiries. And we need reforms and measures put in place that are recommended by Indigenous communities. The fate of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children is really one of our great existential threats. If you look at the incarceration rates for Aboriginal children, they're, probably the highest in the world. In the Northern Territory, 100% of the children in detention are Aboriginal. As an example, there have been inquiries of late looking into the detention centres, and some children have been held in isolation for more than 200 days. And it's not just Don Dale, it's not just Banksia Hill, it's also occurring in South Australia, and it's also occurring in Victoria, where the rate of Aboriginal removal, the rate of removal of Aboriginal children from their families is the highest in the country. So this is why we need to have a voice to address the federal system the Commonwealth and the states and territories with a suite of measures that will actually work in Indigenous communities. All of these statistics have been becoming progressively worse over the years. So there's really no wriggle room. If matters continue as they are, in just 2 or 3 years, the rates of disadvantage will exponentially increase, threatening lives, and especially the lives of the young. As I said, 60% of our population are under the age of 25. We can't have a situation where the states resort to criminalising and incarcerating children as the only solution for their behaviour. There are other measures, and we know of many programs that work to keep children out of juvenile detention. And one of them, for instance, is restorative justice or justice reform measures that begin early in life to encourage children to choose the pathway that will keep them out of juvenile detention. Also, for instance, just an example from the state I live in, the Koori courts in Victoria work marvellously well. And one of them has had a special brief on breaches of apprehended violence orders in relation to family and domestic violence, and that's working very well. So I could go on and on. These are complex policy issues. We need to consider the Federation as the system in which these policies are developed. Each state will want its own jurisdictional solutions, but they must be based on solutions that will work in the communities, not solutions that somebody in Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne thinks will work.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer to my question. In fairness, we should go to others and hopefully get through a fair few of them. The next question is from John Paul Janke from NITV.
John Paul Janke, The Point, NITV and SBS. Distinguished Professor, great to see you again. Thank you for your speech today. You've worked in Indigenous affairs at all levels for many decades. You've worked across the diverse range of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. You've just highlighted some examples of the issues that a voice to Parliament could have a say on, but those campaigning against the vote say that it won't make any difference in our communities. What's your message to those no campaigners and those maybe who are still undecided as to what real difference a voice to Parliament will make to our communities?
Oh, well, just to give you an example, one person said recently, if they want a voice, learn English. Now, yesterday, Senator Jacinta Price declined to approve of that person. Well, why? Because of the Iparinya School, whose governing committee she chairs, I believe, teaches their curriculum in the 4 local languages spoken by the Indigenous children from the town camps who attend the school. So, you know, they're throwing out highly curated slogans to the public, but behind the slogans, at least some of them understand exactly the problem. Cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, extreme disadvantage, and the priority that children must take. Now, another slogan is, you know, jobs, 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 get a job. Well, how can you get a job if there are no jobs in your community other than work for the dole? How can you travel miles from your home at risk of losing your social housing and be work ready and skilled to take up jobs? Well, there are some programs that have worked briefly and many haven't because of the housing problem. So many years ago when Sir Michael Marmot visited Australia, and he's a renowned public health specialist, designed the social determinants of health framework, because if you go to the doctor and get pharmaceuticals, your problem is solved, but if there are underlying problems, the health problem comes back. And that's what's happening in Aboriginal communities. That's why we have chronic diseases at epidemic levels, like diabetes, leading to blindness, amputations, severe disability and early death. Kidney dialysis, kidney disease. So how do you tackle diabetes in a systematic way? Warren Mundine laughed at the social determinants of health framework, which is used universally now, and said it was fairyland stuff, quote, quote. Well, no, it's not. In order to tackle the wide range of disadvantages, we need to start with the basics, the social determinants: housing, education, and, health services. So another falsehood's been thrown around. Indigenous Affairs gets $30 billion a year. I think it was Tony Abbott who said that. It's a complete falsehood. And it's a ridiculous statistic. In fact, in relation to the health budget, Indigenous Australians get less per head than other Australians. So we're a long way from health parity because there is insufficient funding, assuming that our health is like other Australians, which it isn't, and not enough funding for the chronic issues. So there's hard work to be done, and it's pointless to throw around neoliberal slogans like jobs, 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 if people are too sick to get a job, if people are disabled and have no housing.
Thank you. Now our next question is from Rosie Lewis of The Australian.
Thanks, Professor Langton. I wonder what, in your view, is the pathway to success in the next 5.5 weeks. Do you agree with Noel Pearson it's to listen to the soft no's and to answer their questions? And how do you personally convince the soft no's to vote yes?
Well, my view is that truth-telling is the main exercise. Our arguments have been entirely misrepresented by the No campaign and in much of the media for a long time, mostly because of ignorance of Indigenous Australia. Who's got time to read the Productivity Commission report? How many journalists actually know what our suicide rates are? And so, I think it's incumbent on those of us in the Yes campaign who are seeking the approval of Australians for the Yes vote to give them information and show them where the information comes from and explain that these are the facts, and to discourage them from taking the falsehoods to heart. And, they're very clever falsehoods. They appeal to the long-held tropes of discrimination. We've heard words like squalid, underbelly, maintain the rage thrown about. It's as if, the frontier wars were still happening. It's very disappointing that so many Australians have been deceived, and so we have an obligation to make sure that the undecided voters hear the truth. And that means giving them the kinds of facts and figures that I've outlined to you today.
Next question is from Tom McElroy of the Australian Financial Review.
Thanks, Professor Langton. Thanks for taking our questions. Your report with Professor Karma says that under the model that you outlined for the National Voice, that federal parliament would be obligated to ask for advice on a defined and limited number of topics relevant to Indigenous people, and that there'd be an expectation on other areas. Is that still your hope if there is a yes vote in 5 weeks or so? And is there anything to fear from that word obligation on the federal parliament to consult?
There's nothing to fear. If a voice were to eventuate, those matters would be set out in legislation, and they'd probably look quite different from what we recommended. Does the parliament have an obligation put parameters around its questions to the Voice. One would think so. I mean, what would be the point of asking, as somebody did recently, what do Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people feel about how AUKUS submarines reverse? So, you know, there have to be standards with the question. That's, you know, the point of having a legislated regime. Would there be an obligation? I don't know. That's up to the Parliament. An obligation on the Parliament to seek advice from the Voice? I don't know. That's up to the Parliament. So when we tabled our report with Minister Ken Wyatt, he took it to Cabinet, and of course we had produced an interim report, and likewise then Minister Ken Wyatt took it to Cabinet. So twice our reports went to Cabinet. Peter Dutton was sitting in both of those cabinets. He received those reports, and yet he says there's no detail. Well, if he'd read the report, he might have asked me the question that you just did. And it's a good question, but it's to be answered by Parliament.
Thank you. And the next question is from Josh Butler. Josh Butler of The Guardian.
Thank you, Professor, for your speech. I'm Josh Butler from The Guardian. When you appeared with the Prime Minister in March when he announced the referendum question, you spoke about how all the Indigenous leaders in that process had been involved in major initiatives over a long period of time. You talked about the Dondale and the Deaths in Custody Royal Commission, the inquiry into forced removal of children. You talk to people in these processes, and it seems like this is, I guess, the Voice referendum, the next big step, sort of knitting together all these threads of history. What would failure in this process represent to you? What would a failure in the referendum, what would that represent to you?
Well, you know, just to add to your question there, Senator Patrick Dodson and myself worked on the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in 1989 and 1990. It was tabled in 1991, and still today state jurisdictions are being asked to implement the very same recommendations, such as some of the recommendations of the Yoorrook Justice Commission yesterday. I fear that a no vote will be interpreted, and falsely I should say, as a mandate for governments to do nothing and to make our lives worse. I think that's the greatest danger. I also fear that a no vote will be perceived, and again I say falsely, as a mandate for not establishing consultative bodies. And again I say that's false. That would be a false interpretation of a no vote. Many Indigenous Australians who are on the front lines of dealing with these problems in towns and cities and communities and outstations and homelands are very worried about the prospect of losing the voice, because they already have little say, and a loss will mean that they will have even less. So these are matters of great concern. I do hope that the government sets out an agenda for reform that's based on common sense, on the recommendations of many inquiries and royal commissions, and on expert advice before the rabble take over and turn a no vote into a mandate to cause us even further harm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are you suggesting that the government should set that agenda out before October 14 or in the wake of October 14?
Well, it must be as soon as possible. If the government is not inclined to set out the agenda before the vote, then they should do so immediately afterwards. And that means they should be prepared now to tell us what the future holds for us.
Next question is from Karen Middleton of the Saturday paper.
Professor Karen Middleton from the Saturday paper. Thank you for your address. Some people who say they have concerns about the Voice proposal are expressing concerns about its permanency. You've talked about why you felt that it should be permanent, but I've heard people say that if the objective is to address the disadvantage primarily in Indigenous communities, and that objective is ultimately achieved through this process, they then argue the Voice becomes redundant. They say, we've achieved the objective, but we're stuck with the voice in the Constitution. What do you make of that argument, and what do you say to people who might hold those concerns?
Well, first of all, I emphasised some of the closing the gap trends. I could have talked about cultural heritage issues. I could have talked about native title issues. How do we transform the present native title situation into opportunities for economic development for Indigenous people? I could have talked about the involvement of Indigenous people in their own cultures and teaching their own cultures. I could have chosen any emphasis, but I chose what has been so very important to us for years through the voice co-design process and the closing the gap process. So I've taken one slice of the problems that we face in the future. Now, if the voice proposal succeeds, the recognition and voice proposal succeeds, Parliament would legislate it. Legislation can be changed by any Parliament. And so, wonder of wonders, let's say that we reach parity in life expectancy. Well, that's not going to happen for the next 50 years on present trends. Then the voice would no longer be required to give advice on life expectancy. And if all of the closing the gap problems were to result in parity or near parity, there would be no closing the gap issues for it to advise on. But that's not going to happen in your lifetime or my lifetime. It's not going to happen in the lifetime of a young Australian. That does not mean that there are not other issues to be addressed. Cultural heritage issues, retention of Australian languages and transforming native title into economic opportunities, all of these issues remain, and they will remain in the future. Our cultural heritage is not going to disappear, and nor will the problems of, encroaching development and the potential to destroy our sacred sites, our sites of significance, the environmental areas that are meaningful to us. All of these issues will remain forever, I expect, if we survive. Another one is environmental protection. So most people don't know that of the Aboriginal estate and Torres Strait Islander estate, that is the lands in which we have, the lands and waters in which we have rights and interests, 1/4 has been entirely devoted to environmental and biodiversity conservation. That is a larger contribution than any other group in Australia, and that shows you what our values are. And that involves Indigenous protected areas across the country and thousands of rangers, some on work for the dole pay. And that reflects our values too. Those values, we hope, will never go away. Australians should value that. They should appreciate that.
Thank you.
Next question is from James Elton from the ABC.
Thank you. Just to pick up on your point about the importance of truth-telling, you and Noel Pearson have said that there will be a withdrawal of people like yourselves from the public debate and discourse in the event of a no vote. If that happens, and in that context, what should happen to the process of formalised truth-telling? Can that still go ahead?
Well, Noel said that he'd withdraw from public debate. What I said to our journalist at The Australian was that I would not give another welcome to country. And then, social media lit up with cookers saying, oh, good, we won't have any more welcomes to country. Well, that's not what I said. Other Aboriginal people are entitled to do whatever they like. And if they want to continue to welcome people to their country, their specific country, like this Ngunnawal or Ngambri country, fine by me. I said my country. That's the point that they don't understand, isn't it? Now, would I decline to be involved in public debate? Not on matters close to my heart. I will continue to advocate on matters relating to family and domestic violence, as I have for many years, on environmental protection matters, as I have for many years, for decades. You can go to my second book, Burning Questions on that matter, published in 1998, or matters to do with Aboriginal art, film and culture in a book I published in 1994. Well, I heard it on the radio. So I won't stop writing while, you know, the eyes and the hands work, but I think the debate will change so radically if the no vote succeeds that our advocacy will be seen as ineffectual, and so therefore how we participate in the public square will be very, very different, because the levels of abuse against the Yes campaigners, including death threats and daily published insults and abuse, takes a toll. And I think our generation of leaders will hand over to younger leaders, and they too then will become targets like Adam Goodes, like Stan Grant, and the cycle will continue. And in this regard, I think the media has a responsibility to lift their game in reporting on these issues and not participate in pile-ons on persons who are good and decent people.
Thank you for the applause there, and thank you for that remark. I think there's almost another whole run of questions we could ask about what you just said, but I want to continue, given we have other journalists here with other questions. Joel Philp from Sky News.
Yeah, hi there. It's a bit of a follow-on from that question, actually. If the polls are right and the Voice isn't successful, would you be interested in working with a future coalition government on a referendum for constitutional recognition, as Peter Dutton has promised?
Not in the least.
Would you like to elaborate on that? Because I know that this idea of the second referendum has really taken off since Sunday, and it's been, you know, strongly criticised, but it's now formal coalition policy. I mean, do you see any point at all in a second referendum?
There's no point in a second referendum because it's not what we want. As Peter Dutton outlined the purpose of his referendum, or to the extent that he did, it is not what we asked for. So on those grounds, no, I'm not interested, and I know that over 80% of Indigenous Australians would not be interested. And we would communicate that very clearly to the Australian people should he ever be elected. The other matter is that it would serve no purpose. We asked for recognition through a voice combining the symbolic and the practical to give us both dignity and a sense of empowerment and responsibility in matters that affect us. Peter Dutton's proposal, to the extent that I understand what he's talking about, does not.
We have run out of time. We have one last question, which is Courtney Gould from NCA Newswire.
Thank you for your speech, Professor. You spoke at length about your Marcia Langton report in your speech. Was it remiss of the Prime Minister to have never formally endorsed your co-design report, considering claims of a lack of detail have been a driving feature of the No campaign?
He's said over and over again that the constitutional question is about the principle that goes into the Constitution and that the detail is to be legislated by the Parliament. And that's the answer to your question. We can talk about all the models in the world, but what is the most refined and elaborate model is the Marcia Langton report, actually co-designed by 52 people with a range of wonderful public servants who worked closely with us, and based on consultations with tens of thousands of Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. It's the best model out there. Sure, you can have some quibbles about a few points in it, but this matter arises after the referendum, should it be successful, and would be legislated by Parliament. But there is another opportunity for this government, and that is to consider what it would do should the Voice referendum fail. And then I do hope that this government would turn to our report for inspiration for policy settings to empower us, to involve us in closing the gap and other issues that affect our lives.